Good afternoon, Chair Scheibel and the members of the Joint Committee. I'm Cameron Ballantyne. I'm the Executive Director of the Nevada Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. I'm thrilled to be before you today, and thank you for the opportunity to present and advocate on behalf of these urgent topics. Unfortunately, domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking affect so many Nevadans. We appreciate your leadership and commitment to tracking these policies, to tackling them, and what we believe will prevent, intervene, and respond to violence throughout our communities. At this time, I'm going to pass the time over to our policy and subject matter experts, Sarah Sylvanus, the NCEDSV's Communication and Policy Director, and Serena Evans, the NCEDSV's Policy Coordinator. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron. Good morning, Chair Scheibel and members of the committee. I'm Sarah Sylvanus, the Communications and Policy Director for the Coalition. What is now NCEDSV was founded by the then only 5 domestic violence agencies in 1980. Over the last 40 plus years, the Nevada Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence has grown to include various partner members that provide services to domestic and sexual violence victims across Nevada. We serve as an agency that assists our direct service providers with training, technical assistance, advocacy, policy support, a micro and macro perspective on how these issues are evolving, and subsequent prevention and intervention opportunities at every level. We coordinate with experts doing the daily work to assist survivors, as well as with other professionals who interact with victims and their loved ones, researchers, policymakers like you, and many others to ensure that survivors are heard, represented, and included in all aspects that influence their safety, as well as perpetrator accountability. Without us, there would be no statewide and national voice, nor consistency in materials or across trainings. Small and emerging programs would struggle to find and compete for funding, or ensure that their fledgling programs were starting off on stable footing. They would not feel certain about where to call when in need for help for solving those challenges that inevitably arise as they take on the task of serving individuals who have experienced some of life's cruelest abuses at the hands of someone who has professed to love them. Slide 2, please. Our membership is comprised of a wide net of groups and individuals, from our program members who are on the front lines, deserving the essential services in spite of a ravaging global pandemic, to others within the social services field who are also scrambling in the face of grossly inadequate funding while living in the richest country on earth as the backdrop, as they try to preserve a desperately tenuous safety net to keep our mutual clients from sinking completely into obscurity. Our members also include students, couples, seniors, and victim survivors who support those for whom my colleagues and I are here. Some of you may already be one of those members, but ultimately the work that we do is guided by the needs of those victim survivors here in Nevada. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my policy coordinator, Serena Evans, to discuss a deeper dive into our services and numbers, but I will stand by for questions. Serena?
Thanks, Sarah, and good afternoon, Chair Scheibel, members of the committee. As always, it's a delight to be here in front of you today. Before we do a deep dive into the discussion of advocacy services throughout the state, I want to first highlight all of the amazing programs in Nevada that serve victim survivors day in and day out. Every community-based domestic and sexual violence advocacy program in Nevada is pinpointed here on this map, and this is just to give you all some context of where programs exist in the state. Before we dive into the depth of the discussion, I always just like to offer a trigger warning. We know that domestic sexual violence and commercial sexual exploitation are inherently emotional topics, and some of the materials and anecdotes presented may be uncomfortable to hear. So if at any point you need to look down, look away, take a breather, or excuse yourself, please do so. To begin, I would like to talk about what domestic violence is. There is a misconception that domestic violence is only physical harm, such as hitting, choking, broken bones, bruises, and physical marks that can be seen. The truth is, though, that domestic violence is far more than just physical violence. Domestic violence is a systemic pattern of power and control. While domestic violence can certainly be one instance of physical violence, more often than not, it is a reoccurring pattern of threats, assertion of power, and the installation of fear. In many stories we hear from victim survivors, they are groomed by their perpetrator to tolerate power and control, and that is then when the physical violence starts. There are many ways in which domestic violence presents itself. One of the most common and often overlooked forms of domestic violence is emotional abuse. This is the degrading remarks, the constant belittling, and the gaslighting. Gaslighting essentially is a form of manipulation, creating a false narrative, forcing the victim survivor to question their own reality. Financial and economic abuse are also increasingly common in domestic violence. Financial abuse looks like sabotaging someone's employment, destroying their credit, taking out loans in their name, or withholding accesses to finances as a tool to keep them put. Another common tactic of abusers is to isolate their victim survivor. This can mean sabotaging relationships, not letting them see friends or family, and oftentimes moving them to new locations as to uproot their social circle and safety net. While not physically aggressive, survivors, we also hear about stories of coercion and threats, inflicting fear and psychological violence. This can look like your perpetrator coming home and not saying a word, but very quietly getting the gun out of the safe and cleaning it at the kitchen table and or putting it by the armchair of the couch that you're sitting at. And while this isn't inherently violent, we know that the psychological violence has lasting effects on victim survivors, and it's a way to control them. Of course, this list is not exhaustive to what domestic violence is, as domestic violence is unique to each victim survivor. So how common is domestic violence? Unfortunately, it's far more prevalent than it should be. More than 1 in 5 violent crimes is a domestic violence case. Putting that into perspective of how many individuals it affects, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have been victims of severe physical violence. Not only that, but 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical aggression by an intimate partner. It's easy to look at these numbers and statistics, but I challenge you all to think about how many family members and friends you have and try to conceptualize how many people in your lives have likely been affected by domestic violence. Additionally, I would like to note that the presence of a gun in a domestic violence relationship increases the risk of homicide for the victim survivor by 500%. While it is incredibly telling to look at the national statistics, law enforcement numbers, and reported statistics, the true story really lies within the number of contacts and clients that our programs see and serve. For many reasons, victim survivors do not report their abuse to law enforcement. It's not always the safest option to seek assistance from law enforcement. And when trying to leave an abusive relationship, rather, victim survivors seek assistance from community advocacy programs to assist with things such as safety planning, emergency shelter, legal advocacy, support groups, and case management. On this slide, I've included numbers from our quarterly statistic reports from 2018 up until 2021. These numbers come to us from our program members, and our program members are not necessarily every direct service provider in the state, so I want to make sure that that's clearly expressed. Additionally, with our current membership makeup, these numbers primarily reflect services throughout Northern Nevada and our rural communities. These numbers really help paint a picture of the number of victim survivors that our programs serve every year. I won't go over all the data, as you can all view that in your own time. But just a couple of numbers that I really wanted to highlight for you all is the number of case management services and hotline calls that our programs receive have steadily increased since 2018. And from 2020 to 2021, you will see that there is about double the amount of face-to-face crisis intervention services requested. Since the pandemic has hit, all individuals, including victim survivors, have been seeking a sense of community. And with such unprecedented times, we have heard from our program members that victims are reaching out for assistance with food insecurity, applications for public benefits, connections to employment opportunities, along with needing the emotional support that victim advocates can provide. As you'll also see, some of the numbers such as emergency motel bed nights and individuals attending professional therapy sessions has kind of fluctuated over the years. And this is likely due to the cuts in and the availability of funding. Looking more into the number of clients served throughout our programs, we can also look at this important data from our national partners at the National Network to End Domestic Violence, also known as NNEDV. Each year, they conduct a nationwide survey to screenshot just how many victim survivors are served throughout the United States in just one 24-hour period. I've included the Nevada-specific data for you all to review here for 2018, 2019, and 2020. The 2021 data is not yet available, but you can see that, for instance, in 2020, there was 501 victim survivors that made contact with our 17 programs throughout the state, or 14 out of the 17, I should say, as only 14 organizations participated that year. As we talk about domestic violence, we also have to talk about the truly heartbreaking reality of Nevada being an unsafe place for women. In the past 11 years, Nevada has consistently been in the top 10 states for women murdered by men. Most recently, in 2019, Nevada ranked third. 35 females were murdered by men, 78% of which were by gunfire. And of those lives lost, 94% of the victims were murdered by someone they knew, with over half of them being wives, common law wives, partners, ex-girlfriends, ex-partners of the offender. These numbers are atrocious, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this report does not include murders of Indigenous women, and that the numbers of murdered women in Nevada is likely much higher than what's reported here. So what can we do? It's clear that domestic violence is a problem in Nevada, and we, meaning the community advocacy organizations and policy members like yourself, must prioritize prevention. So there are many different interventions and pathways to prevention. First being increasing economic opportunities. According to the Centers for Disease Control, increasing pathways to financial self-sufficiency and economic support is one of the most effective ways at decreasing risk factors for domestic as well as sexual violence. Of course, domestic violence occurs in every socioeconomic class, but when folks are financially dependent on another or have no financial supports, they are far less likely to be able to change their environments. We know that the more economic stressors present, the risk for domestic violence also increases. By creating opportunities for affordable healthcare, access to education, increasing public benefits, and paying people fair wages, we are guarding them with tools to prevent violence within their own lives. Also successful in violence prevention is access to safe and affordable housing. We know that domestic violence is one of the main causes of homelessness amongst women, and consequently, being homeless greatly increases an individual's risk for domestic or sexual violence perpetration. As we talk about domestic violence prevention, we must also talk about anti-oppression work. You cannot achieve the elimination of one type of violence without eliminating all violence. Marginalized communities such as Black, Latinx, and LGBTQIA+ communities all experience domestic violence at higher rates than their white cisgendered counterparts. So domestic violence prevention is truly rooted in anti-oppression work. We can also not end violence if we don't teach about what violence is in teaching our youth healthy relationship skills. So proper education is also an important and necessary part of our prevention. And lastly, being a state that ranked 3rd for women murdered by men, majority of those by gunfire, we have to prioritize stronger firearm provisions, and we are doing a disservice to victims by not. At this point, I'm going to switch gears and focus on sexual assault in Nevada. First and foremost is understanding what sexual violence is. Currently in the NRS, sexual assault is only defined as penetrative rape, but sexual assault is far more than just rape. Sexual violence is any unwanted touching or sexual contact, unwanted fondling or groping, forced masturbation of yourself or another, forced sexual touching of another, exposing one's genitals to another without their consent, forcing another to watch pornography or sexual acts against their will, or watching someone in a private act without their permission. Also is the dissemination of one's private photo or videos, sometimes referred to as revenge porn. Sexual assault also includes things like the unwanted removal of someone's clothing, and of course, penetrative rape. Most importantly, as we talk about sexual violence, we need to talk about consent. Lack of dissent does not constitute freely given consent. Many victims are coerced, taken advantage of, or are in an absolute state of shock or fear for their lives, causing them to not fight back or dissent to the assault. Consent to sexual assault is also not consent to all sexual acts. So meaning while one person may consent to oral sex, that does not mean that they are necessarily consenting to penetrative sex. Again, with this list, it's not an exhaustive list, and each victim survivor's perspective and experience with sexual violence is unique. As I did with domestic violence, I want to share some alarming national statistics on sexual assault that paint a picture of the prevalence in our communities. Nearly 1 in 5 women and 1 in 71 men experience rape. As discussed earlier, rape is not only the form of sexual assault, and as such, 81% of women and roughly 43% of men experience some form of sexual harassment or sexual assault throughout their lifetime. Oftentimes, there's a narrative around sexual assault that it is a stranger in a bush that comes out and attacks you, when in reality, victims more often than not know their perpetrator. In a study of adult victim survivors, 73% knew their assailant. And focusing specifically on the criminal justice aspect, sexual assault is incredibly prevalent in our communities, but only about 1/3 of assaults are ever reported to law enforcement. Even more heartbreaking is that of every 1,000 sexual assaults reported to law enforcement, 975 perpetrators will walk free. Knowing how underreported sexual assault is, advocacy organizations play an important role in offering support and healing to victim survivors, whether they choose to report or not. On this screen, you'll see statistics from our program members. I do want to note that NCEDSV became a dual coalition back in 2017. Prior to that, we were only a domestic violence coalition. So our capacity for sexual assault has grown with each passing year. In 2018, this was the first year that we collected sexual assault data, so the numbers are pretty bleak, and that is because our sexual assault program membership was low. As the years have progressed and our capacity has grown, so has our membership of sexual assault programs, as well as with the passage of the Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights in the 2019 legislative session, we were able to train more sexual assault advocates and increase sexual assault advocacy across the state. And while there has been an increase, there's still a need to expand the services. I'll let you all review these numbers. We don't need to go through each line item. When we talk about sexual assault, we also have to talk about sexual assault forensic exams. A forensic exam is conducted by a sexual assault nurse examiner. These exams are often referred to as SANE exams. While not necessary to file a report, an exam increases the likelihood that a report will be prosecuted. Currently in Nevada, there are only 6 SANE exam locations throughout all of Nevada. As you can see from this map, the central rural part of Nevada does not have easy access to a SANE exam. And often in our rural communities that do have a SANE exam location, they're not fully staffed, which means they do not operate 24/7. So folks in our rural communities are often forced to travel very far distances to receive a SANE exam. For those of you who aren't familiar with the SANE exam, I would like to talk about the process and what that entails. The SANE exam is conducted to collect forensic evidence following a sexual assault. These exams are often incredibly invasive, personal, traumatizing, and quite frankly, can be embarrassing. They include a close-up exam of genitals, taking pictures, collecting specimens, and swabbing for DNA. Usually a victim survivor's body is examined by the same nurse head to toe. Unfortunately, in sexual assault, a victim survivor's body is a crime scene. And so if the victim survivor is wearing the clothes from the assault, they are then often stripped of their clothes to taken as evidence and given a pair of donated sweats to go home in. After the exam is completed, a SANE nurse will then provide the victim survivor with prophylactic medication to prevent any pregnancies, sexually transmitted diseases, or infections. This exam can take upwards of 5 hours to complete. And following an assault and before an exam, victim survivors are encouraged not to shower, use the bathroom, eat or drink anything as not to interfere with any evidence that might be living on their body. For an individual in our rural community, they oftentimes have to travel anywhere from 2 to 6 hours to receive a SANE exam. I just want you all to imagine what it must be like having been assaulted, been taken advantage of, having to travel that far with your body being a live crime scene. It's unfair to victim survivors that they have to travel this far just to be able to submit a police report. Domestic and sexual violence prevention do have many similarities, and so in the interest of time, I won't repeat the prevention efforts from domestic violence that also apply to sexual violence, such as increasing economic opportunities. But I do want to highlight that to prevent sexual assault, comprehensive sex education is one of the most effective things we can do, and requiring it in schools. Also is creating supportive environments within our school and higher education campuses. So this means having access to supportive resources, victim advocates, and our school districts prioritizing and creating trauma-informed policies and responses. Prevention really affects every level of our community, and we must invest in prevention at the individual, community, societal, and policy level. As with almost every aspect of life, COVID-19 affected domestic and sexual violence and our service providers throughout the state. While our programs never once stopped providing services, the way in which they delivered services changed. Shelters had to decrease in capacity in order to keep folks safe. Some advocacy went virtual, and our programs had to work tirelessly to ensure they had the proper PPE to keep their staff, offices, shelters, and clients safe. Outside of services provided, COVID also affected the prevalence of domestic and sexual violence. So with increased isolation, unsafe environments were heightened, allowing domestic and sexual violence to increase within homes. Certain survivors also had limited access to awareness of available services or a safe opportunity to reach out to help, whether that be an advocacy organization or law enforcement. We know that marginalized communities experience personal or interpersonal violence at higher rates, and the same has held true throughout the pandemic. While 1 in 3 white women reported having experienced domestic violence during that pandemic, the number grew to 50% for marginalized communities. And while domestic and sexual violence are our areas of expertise, as the previous presentations from law enforcement agencies pointed out, there is a strong connection between domestic violence, sexual assault, and commercial sexual exploitation. Commercial sexual exploitation, also commonly referred to as sex trafficking, is just one type of human trafficking, but we're specifically focusing on sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. Simply stated, commercial sexual exploitation is sexual violence and can and often does occur within relationships. For example, young victims are often lured in or groomed into marriages or romantic relationships only to be exploited by their partners through forced sex work. Trafficking and exploitation can also occur alongside domestic violence when a family member, perhaps such as an in-law, directs the sexual exploitation of the victim. We also know that traffickers often use sexual assault and abuse as a tool to assert power and control over their trafficking victims. Having previous victimizations of domestic violence, sexual assault, childhood sexual abuse, things like that, increases the risk for victim survivors as traffickers often prey upon them. And while the interventions and responses to domestic violence, sexual violence, and sex trafficking may all be unique and different, there is a close connection amongst all of these different forms of violence. So at this time, I'll go ahead and open it up if there's any questions from you all.